For those of you that are not familiar with the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, we are a regional bird conservation partnership made up of more than 50 different organizations, state and federal agencies, nonprofits, universities, and other partners. And our geography covers southern New York, south to Georgia and Alabama. But West Virginia is the only state that we have in its entirety. We're very excited to continue a strong partnership that we have with the West Virginia DNR. And as part of that partnership, we've been working with the DNR on helping them with their state wildlife action plan process for a few years now. And that has included a process of working with them on their CFA or conservation focus area planning. For those of you that aren't familiar with conservation focus areas, they are regions of the state that have been identified by DNR as having concentrations of species of greatest conservation need, and also areas that have addressable threats and where there are opportunities for us to address those threats. And so through that process, the joint venture helped TNC and the DNR in hosting some stakeholder meetings back in 2023. And some of you may have participated in those. And in that process, we talked through some of the specific actions that had been identified. Specifically, the ones that the joint venture was involved with were in Greenbrier and High Alleghenies. And through that process, we talked about some of the actions that had been identified in the CFA planning process. And we helped prioritize those and identify some areas where there are capacity gaps in trying to address those threats and those actions. One of the actions that came out as a really high priority from our partner discussion was monitoring and controlling invasive plants and working to restore native plants. So that has led us to starting to think about what we can do to bring partners together to work more effectively and efficiently in tackling this really big challenge that many of us face in trying to address invasive species. And so that led us to this presentation today that will be brought to us. Our speaker today will be Michelle Fonda. I'm really excited to have Michelle. She's a private lands and invasive species biologist with the West Virginia DNR. And she's going to be talking with us today about a process that she's been leading to map invasive species across West Virginia's natural areas, and then develop plans to manage invasive species in those areas. As I said, I will be recording today's webinar, so I will share that out with the others who registered and weren't able to join us live. But because you are here with us live, it gives you the opportunity to ask Michelle any questions you might have. Feel free to enter those in the chat as we go along, but we will, in case you don't want to forget any of those, but we won't be answering those until the end of the presentation. So we'll hold the questions till the end, but again, feel free to enter those as they pop into your head into the chat. And then after the presentation as well, have a couple questions about invasive species, the role that it plays in your work, and what the joint venture and other partners could do to provide better tools and better resources to help you in that work. So we'll have a short discussion after the presentation as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Michelle, and really excited to hear your presentation.
Yeah, great. Can everybody see the first slide of the presentation?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction, Amanda. So I'm Michelle Fonda. I'm the private lands and invasive species biologist for the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. I'm based out of the Elkins office. And like we mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about a plan that I'm developing to map and manage invasive species in West Virginia, really focusing on West Virginia natural areas that have been designated as really high priority sites for species of greatest conservation need and really rare and valuable vegetation communities in West Virginia. So since people throw around the word invasive to mean a lot of different things, I always like to try and start off just by clarifying what it is that I mean when I say something is invasive. So, first, an invasive species is not native to an area. Native species evolved alongside, the other species in that area. And because of that shared evolutionary and ecological history, they're, embedded in these really deep networks of ecological relationships. Non-native species, because they don't share that, same ecological history, they aren't embedded in, the same network of ecological relationships. And a lot of the time they can have, these negative impacts on the ecosystem. It is important to note that most non-native species are not invasive, but the horticultural industry has historically been and continues to be a real source for introducing new invasive plants onto the landscape. People put these plants into their yards and gardens, and they don't just stay where they're put. They spread into surrounding natural areas, a lot of the time aided by songbirds and other wildlife. The second piece is, the number of, species that are not native to West Virginia is truly countless, but, we really need to focus on the ones that are actually here. So is a plant, in West Virginia, or is it in surrounding areas? So, when we look at these distribution maps for a plant like wavy leaf basket grass that's been kind of an emerging threat, we can see that it's, spreading in Virginia, the capital area, Maryland, and it's made its way into the Eastern Panhandle. And so, tracking that spread and seeing where is it becoming an issue is really important. And then finally, and the piece that really to me makes a plant invasive as opposed to just non-native or adventive, are these negative impacts to the ecosystem, to the human economy, and to human health. And so those negative impacts are really what makes a species invasive in my mind, and really turns it into something that we really want to do something about. So just to, put a little bit more kind of concrete examples behind those, what does it mean for invasive species to pose a threat? So on the left here, we've got Japanese barberry, an invasive shrub. And then on the bottom here, we have a tick. So there have been a few different studies that have shown that because Japanese barberry, it can form these really dense understory thickets that really crowd out other native vegetation. They prevent forest regeneration. But what they also do is they provide a really hospitable environment for white-footed mice and the ticks that carry Lyme disease. And so it's been shown that in areas with really high barberry density, Lyme disease prevalence is higher than it would be in areas where barberry is controlled. And so, these implications for invasive species, not just on the ecosystem, but on human health can be pretty profound. I probably don't have to tell this crowd how important, food sources are for migratory songbirds, but, it's worth reiterating that a lot of our native shrubs have, fruits that these songbirds have evolved to, take advantage of when they're making these, gigantic migrations, in the winter. And so a lot of these invasive species, they don't have the same nutrient profile, they don't have the same kind of macronutrients that these birds are really looking for, these, high fat, high energy food sources. And, but because they're so abundant, they're really the only thing on the landscape for these birds to eat. And so they'll, fill up and then where they can, but, they aren't providing the same, nutritional benefit to these songbirds. The next example is we have the West Virginia white butterfly here on the bottom. So this is a butterfly that lays its eggs, and its caterpillars feed on plants in the mustard family. So native plants that this caterpillar lays its eggs on include things like toothwort and a few other species. But this butterfly will also lay its eggs on garlic mustard. But unfortunately, garlic mustard, the leaves contain these toxins that will actually kill the caterpillars. And so, garlic mustard represents this real, kind of ecological trap for the West Virginia white butterfly. And so, if we want to keep this butterfly that shares our state's name on the landscape into the future, we need to think about, managing invasive species on the landscape that are crowding out those native host plants for, a variety of different insects, not just, the West Virginia white butterfly. Just to reiterate that kind of host plant and insect interaction, another negative impact that invasive species have on the landscape is that they can also harbor, other invasive pests and pathogens, and other, things that we don't want on the landscape. So up in the top right here, we have the tree of heaven, really kind of nasty invasive tree. The roots can push through concrete, impacting that kind of infrastructure, the economy angle. And it happens to be the preferred host plant of the spotted lanternfly, another invasive species that's garnered a lot of interest. Recently, it has impacts, to agricultural economies through, impacting things like grapes, hops, and some fruit trees. So, all of you beer, wine, and cider drinkers, might be a little concerned about the spotted lanternfly. But the tree of heaven is actually the preferred host plant for the adult spotted lanternfly to lay its eggs and feed on. And so, if we want to think about managing spotted lanternfly on the landscape, one of the really important, management tactics to do that is managing tree of heaven on the landscape. So again, just to, give some kind of more concrete examples of what these invasive species, relationships and harms, kind of look like. So I'll say, when I started this position, this is a new position, this invasive species biologist for the West Virginia DNR. So I was a little overwhelmed. The problem of invasive species can be kind of overwhelming. It can seem this sort of, insurmountable challenge to manage invasive species on the landscape. And so, thinking about how do we prioritize treatment, what do we do first? Where can we make an impact? This kind of phrase, protect the best, restore the rest, comes up in a lot of kind of ecological restoration and invasive species management kind of communities. And so thinking about how can we, protect our most, kind of vulnerable landscapes, the landscapes that, are serving these really important ecological functions on the landscape that we really want to, preserve their, kind of, ecological function. And how can we improve the function of all of these, somewhat degraded or, kind of, moderately impacted landscapes that are, facing some threat from invasive species. And then, how can we align invasive species mapping and management with other conservation goals? So, invasive species are a major threat for a lot of different species, but they're usually not the only threat that, these species and these ecosystems are facing. And so how can we, kind of, work across partners, work across, these different, landscapes and, different priorities to figure out where does invasive species management fit in? And so one piece, that there was a real need that I identified early on in, being hired here is that our invasive species priority list was in, dire need of revision. The list that we currently have was made in 2009. And so definitely a lot of things have changed on the landscape since then. A lot of new species have been introduced, and we know a lot more about the kind of distribution and the ecological impact of some of these species, so that maybe we can, we need to move around some of these different species, even if they stay on the list, but, we think, okay, this is more of an issue than we thought in 2009. Or maybe we take another look at things and we say, okay, maybe this isn't, quite as bad as we might have thought. And so in revising this list, I've looked at priority lists from other states and, surrounding, agency and, other partner agencies to see what they're looking at, what they're seeing on their landscapes and what they're kind of prioritizing, because, if something's in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, but it isn't in West Virginia, according to the distribution maps, it's probably in West Virginia. And so we might, need to think about worrying about that. And also looking at some of our partner agencies. So, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, that are in West Virginia, what are they seeing on their landscapes? Another really great tool that's emerged in just the last couple of years is the USGS has put out this invasive species habitat tool, Inhabit, that provides predicted habitat suitability for occurrence, abundance, and high abundance, predicted suitabilities, these habitat suitability models for over 250 invasive terrestrial plant species. And so looking at, those, where are we seeing on the landscape, if this species isn't here yet, but it, if it got here, this is where it would, spread or be a real problem. Or, if we're looking at, particular areas on the landscape, what are the species that we're most likely to see there? And then finally, the other piece of data that I've been using to come up with the revisions to this priority list are our West Virginia Natural Heritage Program's vegetation plot monitoring data. So looking at the percent cover of non-native plants on these vegetation monitoring plots to see again, what species are, showing up in these different vegetation communities. So just to give a little bit of a background on the West Virginia Natural Areas Program. So the West Virginia Natural Heritage Program, kind of worked to identify the kind of best of the best in West Virginia on state parks and our wildlife management areas. So typically, this represents rare vegetation communities or, high quality, think maybe old growth examples of more common vegetation communities, and these concentrations of species of greatest conservation need. So, these represent these real hot spots for conservation where, if we were able to improve habitat for, species in this particular area, it would make a really big impact. And these are also the areas where if we lost these, to the kind of monoculture of invasive species that, some of our landscapes have unfortunately turned into, that would be a huge loss, in some of these, really high quality areas. And so these were, a clear place where, okay, we can start here. And this is, a clear, place that we've already identified as, being really important ecologically. So thinking about, the goals of developing this mapping program, really trying to just develop a sense of what species are invasive where. What species are really a problem in, these wetland communities or river scour or, our high elevation wetlands or, our kind of, dry, rocky oak woodlands, different species fit into, those different niches as invasives, just like they do for the native species. And there's definitely some overlap. But just to say, okay, a species is in West Virginia or it's everywhere, well, it isn't quite everywhere. So digging down a little bit and seeing what communities are most vulnerable to invasion and which ones kind of resist invasion a little bit more effectively due to a variety of different factors. The plants that are already found there, the geology, different factors can make a specific place a little bit more resistant to invasive species. And again, this kind of question of, even if invasive species are everywhere, if you kind of zoom out, local density is what really matters for developing these treatment prescriptions. So, if you have a park where, an invasive species is present, but that's all you know about it is that it's present, it makes a really big difference whether that's just a few, individual plants spread across the whole park, or 10 acres where it's a hillside that's just covered in autumn olive. The treatment for those two kind of situations is going to be very different. And so trying to develop a better understanding of the distribution of some of these invasive species in these different areas. And again, kind of setting mapping priorities based on the inhabit suitability, so that those habitat models, looking for the common species that are most places in West Virginia, and so they're likely going to be found here, but then also looking at these kind of early detection rapid response species where it might not have made it to this particular park, but we really want to know if it was spreading here and see if we could clamp down on that early instead of letting it spread. Looking at a kind of representative sampling of the community types that are present in a park, say, to make sure that we're fully representing, the kind of ecosystems that are present and, the vegetation communities, the SGCN that would be impacted by invasive species were they to, start spreading in the park. And then again, kind of timing our studies or timing our surveys to see if we can, capture some of those observations of particularly SGCN plants that we would want to avoid during, treatment activities, as well as thinking about the animal SGCN that could be impacted by, treatment activities, particularly something like herbicide. So, once you've kind of got this, mapping done, you've gone out, you've surveyed, you've got all the, points for points and polygons for where the invasive species are on this, chunk of land. Developing a management plan, kind of takes three different parts, I would say. So once you have that distribution data, you can summarize the kind of species extent, what species are present, and to what extent, what is the density, in different areas of the park, and identify these management zones. And the management zones can kind of be based off of vegetation community. So if you've got an early successional area, that could be one management zone. If you've got mature forest, that's going to be another management zone. Or if you've got areas that are separated by kind of some kind of geographical barrier or something that makes it so that as the land manager, you want to manage those, two areas differently, or, you have the opportunity to manage those two areas differently. That, can fit into your management plan. Next, looking at your treatment options. So the most important thing for looking at your treatment options is going to be what species are present. That's going to, determine what, treatments are going to be most effective for, that species that you're trying to manage. You might think about what equipment you have access to. Do you have, a brush hogger? Do you have chainsaws and, weed whackers? Do you have herbicide equipment? And that leads into thinking about what kind of staff, what kind of people do you have to accomplish, these treatments? Do you have people who are, trained herbicide applicators on your staff? Do you have a massive volunteer group that, can come out and do, a weed pull and, pull a ton of garlic mustard for you? Looking at, what kind of staff you have is also going to factor into what treatment options are really available. And then the final piece of that is looking at, your kind of work schedule. If you have a, time of the year where you're really busy and you really can't spare another person to do this invasive species management, is there another time of the year that, maybe you do have a little bit more time, you do have a little bit more resources, picking a, a treatment option that's still going to be effective for that species, but that, is maybe a little bit more flexible or maybe even more effective at a particular time of the year where you can, fit that in along with, the rest of the things that you've got going on. And so then that, final piece, once you've developed these kind of treatment prescriptions based on the species or, guilds of species, invasive shrubs, you kind of can go in and tackle them all at once instead of, just species by species. You go out, you implement the treatment, and then, in a lot of cases, especially where the density of invasive species is really high, you're going to want to follow up with native plant restoration. So, if you remove these invasive species, what's going to take its place? And if you had really dense invasive species, a lot of the time, if you just leave it, as bare soil or, just kind of ripped up, more invasives are going to come in and take advantage of that disturbance. And so, if you, want to be, really proactive about it, coming up with these seed sources, coming up with sources of, live plant material that you can, put back onto the landscape to replace what you've just taken away and, improve the ecological function of that landscape. Some other kind of considerations for native plant restoration, thinking about what native species are a little bit more aggressive, that can kind of, shoulder and bully out some of the, invasive species that might be present in the seed bank and come back. And then, as with most things in invasive management, it's not just a one and done kind of deal. A lot of the time there is going to be, follow-up management, just to, catch plants that weren't, hit by the first treatment fully effectively, as well as, to follow up on anything that's emerging from that seed bank. So just going over, some of the treatment options that are generally, you're going to be thinking about. There are manual and mechanical methods. So, manual methods can, just be, truly just hand pulling or, using hand tools like this, lever tool, the weed wrench or, polar bear type tool are really great for removing invasive shrubs. You have the vice grip around the base of the shrub and lever it out by the roots, and that can be pretty effective. As well as other kind of hand tools, shovels, loppers, those kind of things. Mowing or brush hogging can be good in areas where you have a kind of homogeneous infestation of invasive species, especially as a pre-treatment before herbicide application. If you kind of mow it down and then wait for it to exhaust a little bit of that root stock and grow up some more, and then go in with an herbicide application, that can a lot of the time be more effective because you can use less herbicide because you're treating less foliage, and you're not having to go into vegetation that's 6-8 feet high, but you're also drawing down that root reserve just a little bit before you go in with the herbicide. And then, manual methods are, typically require a lot more people. They, are really time intensive. And so, a lot of the time they're really better for a low density infestation. You're not really going to want to be out there, hand pulling stuff when it's really dense. Next is, chemical. And so, with that, the species that you're dealing with is going to determine the choice of herbicide. And so we always want to choose the herbicide that's going to be most targeted towards, the species that we're, trying to control, and is not going to impact the, desirable species that may be present on the site. The application method. So, choosing for that selectivity is, very similar to, choosing the choice of herbicide. Kind of the least selective methods include, kind of broadcast foliar spraying. Then there's, spot spraying of foliar application. And then, there are the kind of individual plant treatments. So here we've got, a demonstration of a basal bark treatment where, you're spraying the, only the stem of the plant that you're trying to control. And so, there's very minimal, overspray onto any, surrounding vegetation. And then, cut stem methods, even more selective, where you're, making the incision into the bark of the plant, or, you're cutting the stem down and just spraying that little stump. So again, really targeting the herbicide application, right to the point of, where you actually want to control, and not doing, huge broadcast applications of herbicide if we don't need to. And then finally, biocontrol. So, this is limited species. Here we've got the mile-a-minute weevil. There's also, the Galluricella beetles for purple loosestrife, and a few other biocontrols that are available. And one kind of major consideration for biocontrol is matching the release of the biocontrol agent to the infestation density, so that you can have a density that's enough to control the population of the invasive species that you're looking for, and that the biocontrol agent is able to self-propagate and increase. Just to talk about a little bit more about kind of my plans for 2025, some of the things that we'll be working on in the coming year. Again, like I mentioned, working on the priority list revision for the state invasive species list. I'm hoping to have that out on the DNR website, sometime in early spring. And then developing this mapping and monitoring program for invasive species in state park and WMA natural areas. I'm trying to accomplish some mapping at a number of different sites, state parks and WMA statewide. One thing that I'm pretty excited about, looks like we're gonna have a invasive species management for private landowners workshop here in Elkins sometime in August, September. And then some of the other kind of projects we've got going on related to invasive species management. We've got a stiltgrass solarization project going on at North Bend State Park. And we've also getting started on a project to do some riparian restoration, removing some invasives and doing some planting with native species at a riparian area in the state park that borders a really important mussel stream. And then, additional kind of invasive species management projects, identifying those statewide based on, other interest from other groups and partners that we can work with. And with that, that's all I've got for today, but I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Michelle. We feel free to enter your questions in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute or raise your hand, you can do that as well. I'll start with Christy's question. Do you have a list you could share of the state parks and WMAs you are mapping in 2025?
Yeah, let me, I have it here, let me, in my notes. So for the state parks, I'm going to be working at Audra, Babcock, Blackwater Falls and Canaan, Holly River, Lost River, Pipestem, Twin Falls, and Watoga. And then, potentially a couple other parks once we kind of get the word out, if we, get interest from some other parks that really want to, manage invasive species. And then I'm hoping to visit some of our wetland and riparian WMAs. So I'm looking at Meadow River WMA, Green Bottom, and Short Mountain WMAs.
Great, thanks. Cheryl, I think you had your hand up. If you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask, or type it in the chat, whatever you prefer. But as a follow-up really quickly to Christy's question, Michelle, do you have a copy that you can share, example, or I suppose, what do the actual plans look like that you develop for each of these areas? Is it a standalone plan that you give to the managers, or is it kind of a different format depending on the park?
So it can be a little different depending on the park. Typically, I'll engage with the park superintendent to, talk with them about kind of, what their goals are for the park, and get a sense for, what kind of, staff they have, what kind of, options are going to be available to them. And then once I, complete the mapping, going out and walking the trails and seeing, what the kind of density is in different areas of the park. There's actually a invasive species prioritization tool that was developed out of Penn State that I heard about from Doug Manning, who works with the New River Gorge and the other kind of big rivers, national parks in the area, and he presented about using this invasive species management tool for their national park and national scenic river areas. And I engaged with him, and he was able to send me the tool that's this kind of big Excel macro tool where you plug in the species and the kind of habitat types for the different management zones that you're thinking about, and work through the process of identifying the different species that are present, the density of those species, the kind of and then it spits out what treatment types are potential for that particular species, and then you choose, okay, I want to go in with a basal bark application, or I'm going to use volunteers to do hand pulling. And then at the end, it gives you this kind of treatment calendar that offers you, okay, here's when you could do those different activities.
Oh, that's neat. That seems like that would be a really valuable resource for folks that are working on forest management plans for private landowners as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be able to help put together that schedule of activities, because yeah, it's a lot to help the landowner understand when they have to do what during the year.
Yeah, totally.
Multiple treatments for the same species. So yeah, that's a neat tool.
Yeah, the other kind of beneficial aspect of that is being able to bundle treatments based on species. So again, like I mentioned, if you've got a bunch of kind of invasive biennial forbs, you don't need to go out and treat the thistle at one point, and then treat the mullein another time, and then the whatever. You can go out and anything that you see that fits into that category, you can treat that in the same run. Or same thing with like invasive shrubs. Like you can go out in February or March and get all of the invasive shrubs that you see on the forest with a foliar or basal bark application. You don't need to go in species by species. So yeah, bundling those treatments is really trying to build in that sort of efficiency for how you can manage invasive species on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions for Michelle? Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
I couldn't find the digital hand raise symbol.
No worries.
On Zoom. Michelle, have you seen and are you familiar with the West Virginia Invasive Species Management Plan that was developed probably a decade ago now?
Yeah, the invasive species strategic plan.
Yeah.
It's about 10 years old at this point. And so there's a few things in there that probably need to be updated, need to be changed. But a lot of it is essentially still relevant in terms of identifying some of the areas that are high priority, like we've known about for years and years and years, like the high Alleghenies, high Allegheny wetlands. They're going to be on the list. We're going to want to care about those no matter what. But again, thinking about these other pieces of information that we've developed, and there are new tools to some extent to treat some invasive species. But yeah, the invasive species strategic plan is a really great document.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time working on that, and then right as it got to the finish line, it was determined that it would be adopted as a recommended strategy, and no one was actually asked or
no one's required to do anything
to use it. And I was just wondering if like anybody is using it. Did you have to blow the dust off of it, or like
a little bit, but yeah, figuring out because I mean that's the other thing is that the DNR hasn't had a dedicated invasives person until this position. And so figuring out what kind of gaps there were in, again, those capacity gaps for, who's doing what, for invasive species in different parts of the state, and working with, different agencies, and understanding how the DNR can, again, collaborate to accomplish, invasive species management that fits in with those kind of broader conservation goals.
Thank you. And then I had another question about getting your opinion on how to implement work in the natural areas. So, I agree with your assessment that, they're often very high quality and some of the best. They have rare species, but oftentimes, and at least the one I'm really thinking about, they're depauperate, they're drastically different from their historical condition. And I haven't necessarily seen or heard in the plan or from others like what the desired future conditions of that landscape would be. And so specifically, I'm thinking of Canaan Valley Natural Area, and the Nature Conservancy and Friends of the Cheat through a NIFWIF award have been doing strategic planning around freshwater and terrestrial outcomes in Canaan Valley. And it's becoming more and more evident that there's areas in the natural area that are probably some of the most important places in the watershed for cold water fisheries, particularly brook trout streams.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we're coming to the conclusion is that without, doing some restoration, getting some shade on those streams, et cetera, they're going to continue to, degrade in quality and not support some of the organisms that are currently there.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, I've heard, some DNR folks go, oh no, we don't want you doing any kind of restoration or management inside the natural area. Others kind of echoed what I just said. Well, it's greatly depauperate. The rare species that are there are under stress. They won't be there if we don't, change the current condition of the natural area. And it just seems like, there's a really tough decision matrix there that's hard to figure out, like who can actually kind of guide the decision-making process and or the actual restoration process inside the natural area.
Yeah, definitely a tough question. And yeah, I would say that over the, since the last State Wildlife Action Plan, there's a growing, interest in management, and not just, kind of, in looking at, active management towards conservation and, improving habitat, doing a little bit more active management, as opposed to the kind of, hands-off approach that is, kind of typified, conservation within the DNR and, other kind of agencies. So, yeah, I think, developing, working with the parks and, working with these different areas to talk about, yeah, exactly, what the desired future condition is. And, we want to, no net loss kind of, scenario, but we also, if there are, these different species building in, more of that kind of, climate resiliency, some of those things, totally. Yeah, I think it's definitely tough to shift that kind of framework where we've been like, okay, we don't want to do anything. And there's, parts of it where, okay, there are areas where we really don't want to touch it. We just want to leave it be. But there are definitely, plenty of areas where going in and tweaking stuff a little bit, doing some of that, active planting, could definitely improve the habitat for a wide variety of species. And, we're thinking about increasing, production on some, host plants for, our, native Lepidoptera species that are struggling. A lot of the, those butterflies were really decimated by spongy moth, historical spraying. And, if we can, build back the, host plant base for them, that is definitely a conservation action that, we could go into some of these, areas that have, have some of these, high quality species, but, increase the density a little bit to make that more resilient. Does that answer your question?
Kind of and not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I clarify anything?
Well, so like, I have a great relationship with the park staff here at Canaan. And when I ask them, about working in the natural area, they say, oh, you really need to talk to wildlife. And when I talked to staff in wildlife, they, kind of came up with the answers that I just gave. A, we don't want you in there, or B, we recognize that there's work that needs to be done there, but who actually can make that happen? Who can approve to do some work? That's the part that I still haven't quite figured out.
I haven't quite figured it out either.
Yeah,
You know, I think
that's fair.
the piece of it is that, I think the parks are also in a position where they haven't necessarily done landscape management. That hasn't really been, what they've done outside of, very managed, horticultural landscapes. When the DNR has not, wildlife diversity has not really stepped in to do land management at a large scale. Our folks in game, they do, land management on the WMAs for, production of, game species, but they don't necessarily do land management for SGCN. And so, shifting that focus. And I mean, another thing is just our staff capacity. The parks, if they have, folks who are, trained on, mowers and, brush hogs and stuff, it's not necessarily, they might be busy, in other parts of the park. They don't necessarily, aren't able to work in, the natural areas or other stuff. And I think, what I'm trying to, I guess, do is develop the management prescription so that, we have a list of, here's what, the DNR, the diversity biologist who said this is a really important area, here's what we want you to do about it. And then, figuring out who can actually, do that work. But, in terms of who can approve it, I think largely it's going to be, the park superintendents, and then, potentially some higher staff in the DNR wildlife, and then, DNR parks.
Yeah. Yeah. And in this case, we're not asking park or DNR to actually do or fund the work. We either have funding in hand or think we could seek funding to get the work done.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe we can keep talking about that another time.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk with you more about Canaan specifically.
It sounds like something that would probably extend beyond Canaan, though, that general concept of bringing all of the right people in the same agency even together to talk about that would probably pay dividends beyond just Canaan, but
oh yeah,
and use
Very
it
much
as
so.
a good example to move forward from. Thanks for the question, Mike. Blaine has a question in the chat. Is there a social media presence for non-native invasive species management information workshops, webinars like this one in West Virginia that can be shared or recommended? It sees a really great potential for cross-selling that information if there is.
There's a cooperative weed and pest management area, so CWPMA, that has kind of, ebbed and flowed in its social media presence. There are, kind of other things that have been a little bit difficult on getting, social media on the DNR side. But there's, there's other kind of avenues that we're investigating to get the word out a little bit more on these different workshops and events that we're trying to promote. But there's a couple of different listservs that are available. The kind of Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Committee, maybe, but the MAIPC, their listserv is fairly active. And, I'm definitely planning on posting, workshops in there, as well as, some other information that people post in there.
Great, and that could be another instance if there isn't any sort of centralized location that we can send land managers or private landowners to get kind of both a source of trusted information, but also kind of a community of people that are also trying to tackle invasive species management. That could be something that we identify as a need, and something that the joint venture can help with advancing.
Yeah.
So I think it can be really helpful in assessing what new materials need to be created and what information gaps there are if we first have a place where we can bring together everything that's there.
Mm-hmm.
James had a question as well. Does DNR have a current comprehensive list of invasive species with their threat rankings?
Yes, we do. So that's on the West Virginia DNR website. I can send the PDF of that and the link to where it is on the website to you, Amanda. But it's on the DNR website, www.dnr.gov. I'll admit that the DNR website is not the easiest to navigate to find what you want, but if you search invasive species, there's a couple of pages, and if you click around in there, you should be able to find there's a sentence in there that's like, view the list of invasive species in West Virginia. And that's the PDF, the 2009 list that I was mentioning. And then when we put out the new list, we'll definitely try and advertise that a little bit to get that out to people.
Great, thanks. Okay. Any other questions for Michelle? Okay, well, if you think of any more, feel free to enter them in the chat. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to pose to the group. As I said, this webinar was kind of part of a broader exploration into capacity and needs associated with invasive species management in West Virginia. And so for those of you that are here that joined us today, I'm curious how you feel about whether you or your organization, whatever your role may be, do you feel that you have the resources that you need to manage invasive species in whatever capacity you do in your role? Or are there additional tools and resources that either you've seen in other places that you wish were here, or that come up kind of in your mind as something that would help you be more effective in addressing this challenge? Anyone feel free to unmute and share. If the chat is more comfortable for you, feel free to do that as well. But would love to open it up to the group.
Sure, well, I'll start from, I'm Jackson, I'm the wildlife forester at the Petersburg NRCS office. And we have a lot of programs and practices that deal with invasives, herbaceous and woody. And we have a lot of good options and have had good success with mechanical and herbicide mixtures. But one thing that we don't really have is goats, because I know that from an environmental perspective, that would be the best one to use. And for certain species, it works really well. So they're just getting that idea. And I don't know how to mobilize the goats of Virginia and West Virginia, but that kind of idea of having more of a management solution instead of products or physical solution, like with the chemical spraying, like for things like Galanthus, you have to use herbicides, but for some others where it's just a repeated overgrazing could work. It's just another nice option to have that I haven't seen any of that here.
Yeah, we're thinking about trying to implement a project to do some prescribed flash grazing with goats in WMA in the Eastern Panhandle, where we've got a real mile a minute problem. And so, yeah, we're interested in kind of investigating, a variety of these different, tools, chemical and non-chemical, that can be used to, address, different invasive species. So yeah. We're definitely trying to get some goats on the landscape.
Great, thanks so much.
Hi, this is Christy Roderick from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. I am the program manager for the NLUFE program, and we implement stream and wetland restoration projects around the state of West Virginia. And we have, the majority of our projects are located within your DNR's WMAs. And we yearly do several invasive species. Usually once or twice a year, we implement invasive species herbicide applications. And I was wondering, and James Stanton's also on the call, he works he's a project manager for the in-lieu feed program. But what I'm curious about is somewhat of a coordination effort, since we are working on your WMAs. We spend, a couple $100,000 a year throughout our program fighting invasive species, and on the WMAs that we have projects on, some of the issues we have are, figuring out what ones are the best, whether it's carpet grass, stilt grass. And a lot of the invasive species come from outside on the, the remainder property of the WMAs. So does the DNR do land management, invasive species control in general on your WMAs?
Yeah, there's some invasive species management that happens on the WMAs, but I would say a lot of it kind of falls under just it either falls under kind of a forestry management perspective, where they're just kind of trying to manage the undesirable understory to do desirable tree release. So they don't necessarily discriminate between native and non-native. They're going after the barberry just as much as they are the striped maple in the understory, or it's kind of an open lands approach to invasive species management, where they're just trying to get non-woody. They're just trying to have a non-woody understory, and so they're going after any shrub that's there practically. Or they might do some release of again other kind of desirable species, but so they do some invasive species management, but I'm also hoping to work with the WMAs a little bit more to get a better understanding of what invasive species are present on the WMAs, and I'd love to talk with you more about that, as well as what kind of management they are currently doing, and how can we again kind of fit that in a little bit. How can we fit more directed invasive species management into the management activities that they're already doing.
Yeah, and the DEP would be interested in targeting outside of our conservation area boundaries. These projects, we monitor and maintain them for a minimum of 5 years, 6 years, but sometimes like the green bottom, for example, we're going to be going longer than 5 years. That's we have a project at Green Bottom. I know you mentioned that one, but yeah, it's just I know there were a couple people from the DNR that we've worked with on invasive species, but like you said, there hasn't really been a position yet. So it's good to know that you guys are going to be shifting to map and understand more of some of these natural areas in the state.
Thanks
James,
for
do you have anything to add to that? Wherever you are.
Sorry, well, I didn't quite catch the last bit of your
Oh,
question.
I was just asking James if he wanted to, he's asked me a couple questions on our chat, if he had anything else he wanted to add to my conversation with everyone about our program. Guess not.
He's unmuted, but we can't hear you, James, if you're speaking.
Oh, yeah. You might just have to put it in the chat.
Yeah, he says his microphone's not working. So we'll give James a minute or so to type some things in the chat if he wants to do that and share anything. But yeah, I think one of the obvious big challenges of invasive species management is the cross-boundary nature of it. Not only is it cross-boundary, but it's constantly coming in from other places. And even within the same agency, as Mike's question pointed out, there are challenges among differences in management strategies and opinions. And so there's even more than other challenges, I would say, is ecological management challenges. Invasive species is one that brings to the forefront the need for constant collaboration and coordination. Looks like some links are being shared in the chat. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I just shared the invasive species priority list that we currently have, the link to it on the website.
Great, thanks. And I wasn't aware of the DEV program. So thank you for sharing that. And I will take a look at that offline and see, maybe I can connect with you to learn more about it and see if there's any opportunity there for further coordination. Seems like you have a lot of resources that you're spending on the WMAs. So it'd be great to make sure
Yeah.
those are.
Yeah, James just put a map in there of on the chat of our
Oh,
project
okay.
locations, and if you open that, there's at least, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, well, 8, 9, 9 of them, or 10 of them are DNR WMAs or Kanawha State Forest Park, but so we have many projects throughout the state where we're fighting the good fight of invasive species. We have certain success criteria we have to get to, and yeah, some of them are definitely harder to manage, and the practicality of it as well. So it'll be good to talk to you further about maybe some coordination efforts.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm especially interested in the mapping and following up. That's often the piece that is not followed through on by a lot of organizations. Don't have the resources to track the impacts of their work and follow up. So it'd be interesting to take a look at that. Mike, did you have something else you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add, just from my perspective, the bodies to get out and do the work, the funding to pay people back, Michelle mentioned the Potomac Highlands CWPMA back when that was a little bit more active. The Forest Service and Nature Conservancy had a strike team that went out and worked on a variety of public, federal lands, state lands, and private lands. And we got a lot of good work done. But when the funding dried up, that disappeared. So, some sort of dedicated funding, and it could be a combination of who it flows through. But to get, dedicated strike crews out there doing the work seems to be a really big challenge. And so I acknowledge, DNR, I worked at state parks at one point, and they just don't really have the staff or sometimes the experience or knowledge. And similarly at the MON, I don't know if the MON has been meeting their invasive species targets in the last several years since that strike team went away. So, just getting, I could see a large funding package being really important to utilize to get the work done in West Virginia.
Yeah, absolutely. The treatment, actually, yeah, getting people out on the landscape and in implementing the treatments is definitely having, more of that kind of, strike team would definitely be beneficial.
Yeah, that's an approach that has been mentioned in other states and has been shown obviously in the past to be effective. It's maintaining it that's the challenge. And I'm not sure if you all are familiar, but I was just recently sent some information about it's called it's a prism, I think is what it's. Do you all have one in West Virginia? I saw the one in Virginia just received some sort of confirmed state funding in a pretty significant amount that people are excited about. And I'm not sure if there's anything similar in West Virginia, but it was kind of an interesting approach that seems to be gaining some traction.
There isn't, as far as I'm aware. But yeah, having a little bit more organization. I think in West Virginia, especially, we really struggle with, kind of two things. Overall, kind of a lack of funding, but then the other piece of it is that, West Virginia is a very, rural state. And so we don't have the kind of population density that, even places like, Pennsylvania and Virginia do. So, getting that, kind of critical mass of people, together to, accomplish some of these things, and, the citizen science element of, mapping and managing invasives. I've talked with some folks in surrounding states, and, they've also kind of agreed that, it would be great for West Virginia to have, a prism, but, it's not clear to me, I guess, how we can get there. And again, like, Mike was mentioning, and, like we've been talking about, that kind of sustainable source of funding to get things done.
Any other questions or any other insights into resources you think would be helpful in your ability or your organization's ability to meet your invasive species goals. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for your time today. Michelle, I really appreciate you putting together this great presentation. And I will, as I said, share the recording out with those of you that weren't, that folks that registered but weren't able to attend. But thank you for those of you that did attend and provided some great questions and feedback. This is the beginning of a conversation for us, certainly. And if anyone in particular is interested in further discussing anything we talked about today, particularly related to coordination among agencies and organizations on invasive species management, please reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat for everyone. And feel free to reach out if you have any interest in kind of furthering that conversation and having a role there. But thanks again for your time. Thank you, Michelle, and stay warm, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.